Thank you. Welcome to the first broadcast of another new series. A new series that we're beginning right now, which we will be calling The 8 Covenants of the Bible. And the purpose of this series is going to be to show one of the several ways in which the Bible can and really should be divided. Of course, the most common way that people usually divide the scriptures is by means of dispensations. And that is absolutely correct, because the Bible clearly shows us that God has dealt with humanity in different ways in different times. And while dispensations are an accurate way of dividing the Bible, we should remember that each dispensation is usually based upon a specific covenant. And as a result, a knowledge of these covenants will help the Bible reader to rightly divide the word of truth. Now, a distinction should be made between the dispensation and the covenants, because while a new dispensation is often based upon a specific covenant, a specific dispensation could come to an end, but the covenant upon which they were based will often continue beyond the particular dispensation which it founded. Now, since much of God's relationships to man is based upon covenantal relationships, we really should make a study of these 8 covenants, and this way we have gained a very important aspect of correctly understanding Scripture. Now, before we get into the 8 specific covenants, let me say a few things by way of introduction. First of all, there are 2 types of covenants in the Scriptures. Altogether 8 key covenants, but these 8 key covenants are of 2 types. Some are conditional covenants, others are unconditional covenants. It's also important that we learn to distinguish between these 2 types of covenants, so that we get a clearer picture of what the Bible is actually teaching. Let me define what a conditional covenant is and what an unconditional covenant is. A conditional covenant is a proposal of God to man, conditioned by the formula, if you will, whereby God promises to grant special blessings to man, providing he fulfills certain conditions contained in the covenant. A man's failure to do so will often result in punishment. So a conditional covenant lays down specific conditions before the benefits of the covenant could be received. And so it's, if you do this, then I will do that. Now, an unconditional covenant is different. An unconditional covenant is a sovereign act of God whereby he unconditionally obligates himself to bring to pass some definite blessings and conditions for the covenanted people. And this covenant is characterized by the formula, I will, and then it is followed by a declaration of God's determination to do exactly as he promised. In other words, an unconditional covenant is not based upon man's responses for the conditions to be fulfilled. It is a covenant in which God promises to bring about certain things, and he intends to bring about those certain things in spite of man's reactions or man keeping his part of the bargain or whatever. So a conditional covenant is determined by man's responsibility to enjoy it, but unconditional covenants are based purely on God's commitment and God's promises to bring about certain conditions, certain blessings, or whatever. Now, of these 8 covenants, 2 of these covenants are conditional and 6 are unconditional. The 2 covenants which are conditional are the Edenic covenant and the Mosaic covenant. But the other 6 covenants are all unconditional. And the unconditional covenants are first of all the Adamic, secondly the Noahic, thirdly the Abrahamic, Fourthly, what is called the Palestinian covenant. Then fifthly, the Davidic covenant. And finally, the New Covenant. In our study, we will look at each one of these covenants. We will look at the 2 conditional ones and the 6 unconditional ones to see exactly what the implications are. Now, one more thing by way of introduction before we move into the specific covenants, and that has to do with the specific covenants with Israel. Now, I mentioned there are 8 covenants, 2 are conditional and 6 are unconditional, and that is one way of dividing them. There's another way of dividing them in that of these 8 covenants, 3 are made with humanity in general, but 5 of these are made specifically with the nation of Israel. The 3 which are made with humanity in general are first of all the Edenic covenant, secondly the Adamic covenant, and thirdly the Noahic covenant. The other 5 covenants, that is the Abrahamic, the Palestinian, the Davidic, the New Covenants, and the Mosaic covenant, are all covenants which God made with Israel. Now, of the 5 covenants that God has made exclusively with Israel, one of these is a conditional covenant, and that is the Mosaic covenant. The other 4 covenants, the Abrahamic, the Palestinian, the Davidic, and the New Covenants, are all unconditional. Now let me say 4 things in general concerning the nature of the unconditional covenants, the 4 unconditional covenants God has made with Israel. 4 things we should carefully note. Number 1, these 4 covenants, the Abrahamic, the Palestinian, the Davidic, and New Covenants, these 4 covenants and their contents must be interpreted literally. Again, remember the golden rule of interpretation, that when the plain sense of Scripture makes common sense, seek no other sense. Therefore take every word at its primary, ordinary, usual, literal meaning, unless the facts of the immediate context, studied in the light of related passages and axiomatic and fundamental truths, indicate clearly otherwise. So the first thing we should know about the 4 unconditional covenants is that they must be interpreted literally, otherwise we get very subjective about this and misapply and misinterpret what these covenants are saying. The second thing about the nature of these 4 unconditional covenants that God has made with Israel is that they are eternal. They are not conditioned by time. All 4 of these are eternal covenants and will continue to be in effect for all eternity. Thirdly, let's reemphasize that these are unconditional covenants. And because they are unconditional, meaning they are dependent upon God's promise and not upon Israel's responses, that would mean that all 4 covenants will never be abrogated, will never be canceled, will never be done away with, simply because of Israel's disobedience. In fact, within these 4 unfulfilled, unconditional covenants that God has made with Israel, we shall see that provision was made in case of disobedience. But because these covenants are unconditional, and because they are expected to have an ultimate fulfillment, and because they're based upon God's promise, we can expect to have an ultimate fulfillment of all 4 of these covenants. Now, the 4th thing to remember about the nature of these covenants is that they were made with one specific people, and that is the people of Israel. The Apostle Paul in the book of Romans chapter 9 verse 4 penned these words, "Who are Israelites, to whom pertains the adoption and the glory and the covenants, and the giving of the law and the service of God and the promises." Now in this verse, Paul delineates various facets of God's revealed word. And notice what he mentions. The covenants belong to Israel. And this passage clearly points out that these covenants were made with a covenanted people and are Israel's possession. And so the mention of covenants has a reference to these 4 unconditional covenants. The expression the giving of the law would be a reference to the one conditional covenant with Israel, and that is the Mosaic covenant. Now Paul brings this out another place in Ephesians chapter 2, verses 11 and 12. Notice what Paul writes here. Wherefore remember that ye, being in time past Gentiles in the flesh, who are called uncircumcision by that which is called circumcision, in the flesh made by hands, that ye were at that time without Christ, being aliens from the commonwealth of Israel, and strangers from the covenants of promise, having no hope and without God in the world. Now in this passage, Paul clearly tells these Gentile believers in the church of Ephesus that they are strangers to the covenants, because these covenants pertain to the people of Israel. So again, 5 of the 8 covenants belong to the people of Israel, and as this passage notes, Gentiles were considered strangers from these 5 covenants, one of which is a conditional covenant, the Mosaic covenant. The other 4 were unconditional covenants, the Abrahamic, the Palestinian, the Davidic, and the New Covenant. Well, we spend our entire time on this broadcast dealing with introductory material, and tomorrow we'll begin dealing with the specific covenants themselves. Until then, we bid you shalom.